All right, so we're back for another deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at Pete Hegseth's book, The War on Warriors.
Okay.
Hegseth, he's a veteran Fox News personality
Right.
and makes some pretty, bold claims about what's going on in the U.S. military.
Yeah, he definitely does. I
Yeah.
mean, his main argument, like the central thesis of this book, is that what he calls
Yeah.
woke ideology is weakening the military from the inside out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's pointing to things like diversity initiatives and the push for women in combat,
Right.
and even like the influence of liberal academia on military leadership as evidence of this.
So he's basically saying that, we've got like a culture war going on, but it's within the military itself.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
He sees it as this clash between, traditional military values,
Right.
and then what he views as this, more politically correct and socially progressive agenda
Okay.
that he thinks is being pushed.
And to prove this, he doesn't just theorize about it. He uses his own experience as an example.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
He talks about being denied reenlistment in the National Guard,
Right.
and he claims that it was because of his political beliefs and a Jerusalem cross tattoo that he had.
It really shows like how much your personal beliefs
Yeah.
are coming into conflict with the military's evolving, culture.
Yeah, and it's a pretty striking example.
Right.
I mean, it really kind of personalizes this whole debate,
So for our listeners who aren't in the military, why should they care about this war on warriors thesis?
Well, because Hegseth believes that what's happening in the military is really just a reflection of much larger
Okay.
societal shifts that are happening.
Okay.
And that, all these changes within the military
Right.
could eventually have a real impact on national security.
If they weaken the military's ability to defend the country.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just an internal military issue. He's really connecting it to broader
Yeah.
cultural trends and kind of the anxieties that people are feeling about these things.
Exactly. Yeah, he sees it as part of a much bigger picture.
Okay.
Now, one specific event that Hegseth focuses on in the book is the military-wide stand-down
Mm-hmm.
that was ordered by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin
Right after January 6th.
to address extremism in the ranks. Yeah.
I remember that. It was pretty controversial.
Oh, it was extremely controversial.
Yeah.
And Hegseth really highlights the involvement of this guy, Bishop Garrison,
Mhm.
who was chosen to lead this initiative.
Yeah.
And he points out that Garrison had expressed some pretty extreme left-wing views in the past.
Interesting.
So Hegseth is kind of suggesting that there's a potential for bias here in how extremism is even being defined.
Right.
And
Within the military.
within the military, yeah.
He's worried about that.
Yeah, he's concerned about, is this really about rooting out extremism?
Mhm.
Or is it about, targeting people with specific political beliefs?
He even questions this whole idea of patriot extremism.
Yes, he does. He really pushes back on that idea.
Which Garrison was promoting,
Yeah, he was promoting that pretty heavily.
And suggests it could be used to target individuals with certain political beliefs.
Exactly, yeah.
So that brings up an important point for all of us listening,
Yeah.
How do we define extremism? And where do we draw that line between legitimate concerns and overreach?
It's a really tricky issue.
Especially when it comes to personal beliefs.
Yeah, especially when it comes to personal beliefs.
Right.
Where's the line between someone having a strong opinion and someone being dangerous?
Right.
It's not always clear.
And he argues that the military's efforts to combat extremism, while well-intentioned, could actually end up backfiring.
Yeah, I mean, he thinks they could end up stifling dissent or targeting individuals based on their political views.
Which would make things worse, not better.
Exactly. It could create more problems than it solves.
Right.
He's not saying that extremism isn't a problem, but he's saying that you got to be really careful how you address it.
And he sees a kind of irony, right?
Yeah.
In the military trying to root out extremism while at the same time embracing some potentially divisive ideologies like critical race theory.
Yes, he definitely sees a contradiction there.
Okay.
He worries that pushing certain ideologies could actually create more division within the ranks.
Right.
So it's like you're trying to fight extremism, but you're also potentially promoting something that could be seen as extreme.
Right, and it's making people wonder, what are we really doing here?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, another big issue that Hegseth tackles in the book is DEI,
Mhm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within the military.
Yeah.
And he is pretty critical of these programs.
Yeah.
He argues that while the goal of having a more diverse military is obviously commendable, he believes that the current DEI initiatives are actually harming military readiness.
Yeah. He thinks that the way they're being implemented is actually counterproductive.
Okay.
He suggests that the emphasis on, diversity statistics
Yeah.
can lead to lowering standards and promoting individuals based on factors other than merit.
And to prove this, he uses some pretty vivid examples in the book.
He does. Yeah.
Go ahead.
He talks about mandatory transgender pronoun training sessions
Okay.
and even something called empathy belly exercising.
Wait, what? Empathy belly?
Yeah, where soldiers wear this weighted belly to simulate pregnancy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty out there.
I've never even heard of that before.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more unusual examples he gives.
Hegseth sees these types of initiatives as evidence of the military prioritizing social engineering.
Over warfighting effectiveness, yeah.
Okay, so he's saying it's gone too far in that direction.
Yeah, that's his argument.
Now, it's important to say that there are counter-arguments to his view on this.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Supporters of DEI initiatives argue that a more diverse military actually brings a wider range of perspectives and experiences
Yep.
to the table,
Mhm.
which can be really valuable.
Right.
They also point out that, there are historical inequalities that need to be addressed
Okay.
and that DEI initiatives are necessary to kind of level the playing field
Right.
so that everyone has an equal opportunity.
But Hegseth seems to be saying that even with the best of intentions, these initiatives could have some unintended negative consequences.
Yeah, his concern is that focusing too heavily on diversity statistics might ultimately weaken unit cohesion and
Okay.
combat readiness.
And this concern kind of leads him into another hot button issue that he tackles, which is women in combat.
Right.
And he is pretty outspoken in his opposition to women serving in combat roles.
He is.
And this seems to be where some of his arguments about physical differences and their potential impact on unit cohesion really, really come into play.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
He believes that, women are just not physically suited for the demands of combat.
Right.
And that integrating women into combat units will ultimately weaken their effectiveness.
He doesn't just stop there, though, with the physical aspect.
Which is deeper than that.
He really digs into some historical examples of women warriors,
Mhm.
and he analyzes the findings of this Marine Corps study on gender integration in combat units.
Right.
And he does that to kind of,
Yeah, he uses those historical examples to argue that women warriors have always been pretty rare.
okay.
And their stories often had, tragic endings.
Mm-hmm.
And then he points to the Marine Corps study, which actually found that all male units consistently outperformed mixed gender units in combat simulations.
This is obviously a sensitive and complex topic.
Oh, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And it's important to acknowledge that Hegseth's views on this are pretty controversial.
Right. And a lot of people really disagree with him.
They do, yeah. And for good reason. I mean, there are valid counter-arguments to his claims.
Of course.
Some people argue that, women have proven themselves capable of serving effectively in combat.
Right.
And that excluding them based on gender stereotypes is discriminatory.
Yeah. So it's a debate with strong feelings on both sides.
Absolutely.
Hegseth also, though, raises these ethical concerns
Yeah.
about sending women into combat,
Right.
suggesting that it could actually lead to higher casualties and psychological trauma
Yeah, he's worried about the potential for increased risk.
for both men and women.
For both men and women, yeah.
So this is another one of those issues where there's really, no easy solution.
No, not at all. It's a very challenging issue.
It forces us to think about, the trade-offs
Yeah.
between equality, military effectiveness, and the well-being of our service members.
Right. It's about finding the right balance. But that's not always easy, especially when you have such strong opinions on both sides of the issue.
From women in combat, Hegseth then shifts his focus to the influence of academia on the military.
Okay.
And he seems particularly concerned about what he sees as this liberal bias
Mm-hmm.
among professors at military academies.
Yeah. He's worried about that influence.
Yeah.
He believes that the influx of civilian professors, especially from Ivy League schools,
Right.
has introduced, this left-leaning perspective that's kind of out of touch with the realities of military life.
And he uses some specific examples to back up this claim.
He does, yeah.
He mentions Elena Kagan.
Oh, right.
the former Harvard law dean who later became a Supreme Court justice.
hmm
He points out that she opposed military recruiters on campus.
Yeah, during the don't ask, don't tell era,
Right.
he uses that as an example of what he sees as this kind of hostility towards the military within academia.
So it sounds like he's worried about this growing divide between the military and what some people call the intellectual elite.
Yeah, exactly. He sees this gap widening, and he thinks it's harmful because it creates a lack of understanding and appreciation
Okay.
for the unique challenges that the military faces.
He also brings up the Supreme Court decision to exempt military academies from the recent affirmative action ruling.
Yes, he sees that as further evidence of this double standard
Right.
that favors the military.
Okay.
They can consider race in admissions, but other universities can't.
Right. Right.
And he questions whether this is truly necessary for national security
Mm-hmm.
or if it's simply a way to kind of circumvent the principle of equal treatment.
So he's basically saying that the military is being given special privileges that could actually undermine the values of fairness and meritocracy.
Yeah, he's worried about the implications of that decision.
Hegseth raises some really, really interesting points about the influence of academia on the military.
He does, yeah.
And it makes me wonder, how much influence should civilian institutions have on the military?
That's a good question.
How do we balance academic freedom
Right.
with the need for a cohesive and effective fighting force?
It's a tough balance to strike.
Right.
You want to encourage critical thinking and debate,
Right.
but you also don't want to undermine the chain of command
Right.
or the military's ability to carry out its mission.
Now, besides woke ideology, DEI, women in combat, and the influence of academia,
Okay.
Hegseth also dives into another controversial topic,
Right.
which is the military-industrial complex.
Right.
And he expresses concerns about the close relationship between high-ranking military officials and defense contractors.
Yeah. He's worried about that revolving door
Right.
between the Pentagon and the defense industry.
And how that can create conflicts of interest.
Exactly.
And influence military spending and decision-making
Mm.
in ways that don't always benefit the troops or the country as a whole.
He thinks it can lead to, inflated military budgets,
Right.
unnecessary wars,
Yeah.
and a prioritization of corporate profits.
Over the well-being of soldiers,
I think it's
this is something that affects all of us, even if we're not directly involved in the military.
It does, yeah, because ultimately
Yeah.
it's our tax dollars that are funding all of this.
Right, right.
And it's, our sons and daughters who are putting their lives on the line.
So how does this relationship impact the choices that are made about military spending and interventions?
Yeah, that's a question we should all be asking.
It's something worth thinking about.
It is.
Hegseth paints a pretty bleak picture of the state of the U.S. military.
Yeah, he's pretty pessimistic.
He seems to believe it's being weakened by all these internal cultural shifts and external pressures.
Yeah, he thinks it's facing threats from both within and outside.
And we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, yeah.
It's clear that his book is raising some really important, albeit controversial, questions about the future of the military.
It's definitely a thought-provoking book.
But there's more to unpack.
There is.
Yeah. So let's dive into some of the personal experiences and anecdotes
Okay.
that Hegseth uses to support his arguments.
Sounds good. Yeah, so the one anecdote that really stood out to me was his experience serving in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
during the unrest that, followed George Floyd's death back in 2020.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he talks about this really stark contrast between, his time in combat zones overseas
Right.
and what he witnessed on the streets of America.
Yeah.
He was facing protesters, some of whom were throwing bricks and yelling insults at him, and even directing racially charged abuse at the black soldiers in his unit.
That must have been a really jarring experience for him,
It was really unsettling for him.
especially having come back from these war zones.
Exactly, and he kind of saw this unrest as a sign that the real threats to America aren't always external enemies.
Right.
He's saying that internal divisions and social unrest can just as dangerous, if not more.
So it sounds like that experience in D.C. really kind of solidified his belief that America is facing this kind of cultural crisis.
He did, yeah. He connects that experience back to his broader arguments about the military and how it's becoming too focused on social justice and political correctness.
Right, and maybe losing sight of its core mission.
Exactly, yeah.
He also takes us back to Iraq,
Yeah.
sharing this gripping account of leading a nighttime raid to capture insurgents.
Yeah.
And he doesn't shy away from describing like the tough realities of combat.
No, he's very honest about that.
Making these life or death decisions
Yeah.
under intense pressure.
He talks about the weight of responsibility that he felt as a leader,
Right.
knowing that his choices could have really serious consequences for his men.
Right.
He also highlights, though, the bonds of camaraderie that are forged in those moments of shared danger and sacrifice.
Yeah, that's a powerful thing.
It's a very human element of war that I think sometimes gets overlooked.
He contrasts that experience with what he sees as a growing trend in modern warfare, which is an emphasis on like legalistic constraints and risk aversion.
Hmm.
And he seems to believe that this approach is actually making the military less effective.
Yeah, he argues that, this kind of mindset, this risk-averse mindset,
Right.
hinders the military's ability to decisively defeat enemies
Okay.
who don't play by the same rules.
Right.
He even suggests that America's commitment to international laws and conventions,
Right.
while morally commendable, can sometimes put its troops at a disadvantage
Okay.
and even prolong conflicts.
That's a pretty provocative argument.
It is, yeah. It's definitely challenging some conventional wisdom.
Is he basically advocating for a more ruthless approach to warfare?
Well, he doesn't explicitly say that.
Okay.
But he does seem to be suggesting that America needs to be, more willing to fight to win, even if it means adopting tactics that might be considered controversial.
So he thinks the current emphasis on, minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding any actions that might be perceived as morally questionable
Right.
could actually be tying the military's hands.
Exactly. He thinks it's creating a kind of self-imposed limitation.
Okay, so he's saying that the military needs more freedom to operate,
Yeah.
even if it means like bending or breaking some of the rules.
That's the gist of his argument, yeah.
He believes that the pursuit of a quote-unquote clean war
Right.
is often just unrealistic,
Mm-hmm.
and that it can actually undermine the military's ability to achieve its objectives.
And it raises some really tough questions
Yeah.
about, what are we willing to sacrifice in the name of morality?
Right.
And is it always possible to fight a war without getting your hands dirty?
Hegseth's stance on this is sure to spark some heated debate.
Oh, absolutely.
It forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions about the true costs of war and that balance between, achieving military goals and upholding these ethical principles.
Right. It's a classic dilemma, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah, it's something that every nation has to grapple with when
Yeah.
they're engaging in armed conflict.
Shifting gears a little bit throughout the book, Hegseth kind of keeps coming back to this critique
Okay.
of liberal ideology's influence on the military.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees this influence as really pervasive,
Okay.
impacting everything from policy decisions to the everyday culture within the ranks.
Okay.
And one example he gives is how the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell kind of paved the way
Right.
for more radical social changes within the military.
He argues that while Don't Ask, Don't Tell was obviously a flawed policy,
Yeah.
its repeal kind of opened the door to this broader push for social progressivism.
Yeah, and he thinks that push has gone too far. He specifically points to the acceptance of transgender service members
Right.
and the push for gender neutrality as examples of this trend.
And he seems to believe that these changes are harming unit cohesion and readiness.
Yeah, he sees it as a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Where the military is constantly being pressured to adopt, the latest progressive social trends,
Right.
even if they have no bearing on its core mission.
Which is to fight and win wars.
Exactly.
And his critique of the military's embrace of diversity initiatives is really pointed as well.
Yeah, he's very critical of those.
He argues that, while the goal of a more diverse military is admirable, the methods being used are just counterproductive.
He thinks they're doing more harm than good.
He believes that this focus on achieving specific racial and gender quotas often results in the promotion of less qualified individuals over more qualified ones.
He uses the term affirmative action gone wrong to describe it.
He thinks that competence is being sacrificed in the name of diversity.
And he doesn't hesitate to name names.
No, he calls people out specifically.
Like he singles out General Mark Milley.
Right, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
for criticism.
He's very critical of Milley
He accuses Milley of being more concerned with political optics,
and with military effectiveness, yeah.
pointing to, his handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal, his support for critical race theory,
Yeah.
and just his perceived deference to the Biden administration.
He sees Milley as being too political.
He also criticizes Milley's decision to rename military bases.
Right, the ones that honored Confederate figures.
Seeing it as like this symbolic gesture that doesn't really address the real challenges facing the military.
Yeah, he thinks it's a distraction from the more important issues.
Hegseth seems particularly concerned about the influence of civilian professors at military academies.
Yeah, he's really worried about that.
He believes that many of them hold these, radical left-wing views.
That are antithetical to the values and traditions of the military.
He thinks they're trying to indoctrinate cadets with a particular worldview
Okay.
that he believes is hostile to America's history and traditions.
He also expresses concern about this growing disconnect between the academic world and the realities of military service.
He thinks that a lot of these civilian professors have very little understanding
Right.
of the sacrifices that are made by those in uniform,
Right.
or the challenges that they face on the battlefield.
He gives examples of professors who have, openly expressed anti-military sentiments or actively opposed military recruitment on campus.
Yeah, he sees that as a sign of disrespect.
It seems like he's drawing this clear line between what he sees as, the liberal elite and those who serve in the military.
He's definitely highlighting that perceived cultural divide.
Right.
And he thinks that divide is really detrimental because it breeds this lack of understanding and respect
Right.
between these two groups.
Hegseth's book is certainly giving us a lot to think about.
It is. It's a very challenging book.
He's raising some important questions about the direction of the U.S. military, even if his conclusions are controversial.
Yeah, you don't have to agree with everything he says,
Right.
but he's definitely raising issues that we need to be talking about.
It's clear that he believes the military is at a crossroads, facing both internal and external pressures
Yeah.
that threaten its effectiveness.
He's sounding the alarm, basically. He's saying, hey, we need to pay attention to this or things could get really bad.
And Hegseth brings up that Supreme Court decision, to exempt military academies from the recent affirmative action ruling.
Right.
As another example of this.
Yeah, like, are we really saying that a diverse officer corps is such a national security need that it trumps, like, the idea of everyone being treated equally under the law? It's a tricky.
Yeah, is it a special privilege for the military?
Yeah.
So he's kind of suggesting that the military is getting this special treatment, even if it means bending the rules.
Yeah, that's his take on it. And it raises this bigger question of,
Right.
How much power should the military have compared to
Right.
civilian institutions? Like, where's that line?
Yeah.
Hegseth seems to be saying we shouldn't just let the military operate
Yeah.
by a totally different set of rules.
This whole book has been a challenge to our assumptions about the U.S. military.
It has. It really has.
He makes us think about the role of political ideology, the push for social justice, and how all these things are impacting the military's ability to do its job.
Yeah, and how much civilian institutions should be, influencing what the military does.
I mean, whether you agree with his conclusions or not, there's no denying that he's raising some really important questions that we need to be talking about.
Yeah, he's starting a conversation that we need to have.
And he doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
No, not at all.
But he does offer this kind of stark warning about what could happen if we just ignore these challenges that he's laid out.
Right, he's saying, wake up, America.
Yeah, before it's too late.
Basically.
I think one of the most thought-provoking questions he leaves us with is what role should ideology play in shaping military policy and culture?
It's such a tough question because on the one hand, you want the military to reflect the values of society.
All right.
But on the other hand, the military has a very specific mission.
Right.
And it needs to be focused on that mission.
So how do we make sure that the U.S. military stays strong and effective, but also reflects the values of a diverse and inclusive society?
Right. It's a balancing act.
Hegseth's book doesn't give us this step-by-step guide to solving all these issues.
No, it's more about raising questions than providing answers.
But it does give us a starting point.
Yeah, it gives us a framework for thinking about these things.
For a conversation that we need to have.
Definitely.
And ultimately, it's up to each of us, right,
Yeah.
to engage in this debate and hold those in power accountable
Yeah.
for the decisions that they make about the military.
We can't just sit back and let other people decide these things for us.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Pete Hegseth's The War on Warriors.
Yeah.
It's a book that's guaranteed to,
Yeah.
get people talking and maybe even challenge some long-held beliefs.
It definitely pushes buttons.
So what are your final thoughts? What should our listeners take away from this?
I think the main takeaway is, read the book for yourself.
Yeah,
Don't just take our word for it. Form your own opinions.
right,
This isn't a book to just passively absorb. It's a call to action.
right.
It's a call to engage with these issues and decide what you believe.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into Hegseth's world.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Always.
Until next time.
See ya.